A suitcase hit the pavement and split open. Clothes spilled into rain. A wrinkled hand reached down to gather them. The other hand pressed against a cab bumper to keep her standing. Behind her, a door slammed shut. A bolt slid into place. She heard her own son turn the lock from the inside. She stood there in the cold rain. No coat. No umbrella. 8 decades of life packed into one cracked suitcase and a purse holding $32. The driver asked her where to. She said the only word she had left. Anywhere. Her name was Eleanor Pratt. 80 years old. By the time the cab pulled away, every person she had ever loved in this world was finished with her. What she found 2 days later, in the attic of a house nobody wanted, would silence every single one of them. Stay with me on this one. The motel sign buzzed and flickered. $28 a night, paid in cash. The clerk looked at her face, looked at the cracked suitcase, and asked no questions. He slid her a key and pointed down a hallway that smelled of old carpet and bleach. Room 14. The bed sagged. The window faced a parking lot full of pickup trucks. Eleanor sat down on the edge of the mattress and counted what she had left in her purse. For dollars in change. 28 in bills. A debit card that would cover maybe 200 more before her Social Security check landed at the end of the month. That was her life now. 40 hours of stretching that money before the next deposit hit. She picked up the phone on the nightstand and dialed her daughter. 3 rings. Voicemail. The recorded voice was bright and cheerful and did not belong to any version of her child she remembered. She hung up before the beep. She tried her son. The line clicked once and went dead. He had blocked the number. She didn't try the grandson. He had been the one who told her, the night before, that his mother said grandma wasn't to be allowed in the house anymore. He had said it with his eyes on the floor and his hands jammed in his pockets. He was 12 years old. He had been the one in the family who still hugged her without being told to. Eleanor set the phone down. She did not cry. There was nothing left to cry with. She slept in her clothes that night because the heater rattled and stopped and she did not want to lie under those motel sheets. In the morning she pulled the curtain back and saw a low gray sky and a diner across the road with a hand-painted sign. She walked over. Coffee was $1. Eggs and toast were $3. She sat in a booth by the window and let the heat from the cup warm her hands and tried to think about what came next. There was no next. That was the truth. She was 80. Her husband had been gone 12 years. The house she had raised her children in had been sold 3 years ago, when her son said it was time, when her son said the money would be safer in a joint account where he could manage it. The money was not in that account anymore. He had explained why. The explanation had not made sense. By the time she understood what had happened, the lawyer's bill alone would have eaten what was left. Her daughter had taken her in for 14 months. Her daughter had a husband who did not like an old woman in the spare room. Her daughter had a husband who counted the cans of soup in the pantry. Her daughter stopped meeting her eyes around month 9. By month 14 the cab was at the curb. Eleanor sipped her coffee and watched the rain pick up outside. There was a stack of free papers by the cash register. The kind small towns still print. Real estate ads, lost dogs, county auctions. She took one because it was free and she had nothing else to read. She turned the pages slowly. Most of the homes were $150,000 and up. She turned past them. She wasn't shopping. She was passing time. Then she stopped. Page 7. A small photograph of a clapboard farmhouse on a half-acre. 40 miles out of town, off a county road. The text beneath it was 3 lines long. Estate sale, no heirs found. County tax auction. Minimum bid $1,800. Eleanor stared at the picture for a long time. $1,800 was almost exactly what she had if she emptied the debit card and added every dollar in her purse. It would leave her with $12 and a tank of gas she didn't have a car for. She tore the page out of the paper, folded it twice, put it in her purse next to the change. The waitress came by with the coffee pot. Eleanor looked up at her and asked, in a voice she had not used in months. If anyone in town rented an old truck cheap. The waitress laughed and said her brother did. $50 for the day. 2 days later, Eleanor stood in front of a county clerk's window with $1,800 in cash spread out in 5s and 10s and 20s, and a man behind the counter who looked at her like she was lost. She wasn't lost. She told him the address and the parcel number. She told him she was making a bid. He told her the auction was that afternoon at 1. She said she would be there at 12:45. She was. When the deed came back 2 hours later with her name printed on it in gray dot matrix letters, she stood on the courthouse steps in the rain and held it in both hands and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like a person again. The truck rattled down a county road that did not appear on any map she could find. The gas station clerk had drawn directions on a napkin. 2 miles past the second silo, left at the white mailbox, 3/4 of a mile to the bend. Eleanor drove with the napkin pressed against the steering wheel. The house was set back from the road behind a wall of dead grass and brambles. A mailbox tilted off its post. The front porch had a sag in the middle where a board had rotted through. 2 windows on the second floor were boarded over. The third was clear glass, dark, reflecting the gray sky. She killed the engine and sat there with both hands on the wheel. This was what $1,800 bought. She got out. She walked up the path. The front door was held shut by a padlock the clerk had cut for her that morning. She pushed it open, and the smell that came out was old wood and old paper and the particular cold of a building that had not been heated in a long time. She stepped inside. The front room had a sofa with a sheet over it, a wood stove in the corner, a bookshelf full of books that had been arranged carefully and then forgotten, a grandfather clock against one wall. Hands stopped at 4:11. She walked through every room, a kitchen with a hand pump at the sink, a pantry with mason jars on the shelves, fruit preserved and labeled in handwriting that had faded to brown, a bedroom with a quilt folded at the foot of the bed, and a pair of women's slippers placed neatly on the floor as if their owner had only stepped out of them an hour ago. A small parlor with a roll-top desk against the back wall. The desk was locked. Upstairs there were 2 more bedrooms, both empty. And at the end of the hall, a hatch in the ceiling with a rope handle. The attic. Eleanor stood under it for a moment. The rope was dust-grayed. She reached up and touched it and then let her hand drop. Not today. Today was for sleeping. Today was for surviving the first night in the first house she had ever owned alone in 80 years of life. She heard the truck before she saw it. Out on the porch, a pickup pulled up the gravel drive at a speed that said the driver had been here many times before. A man got out. 60s, maybe. Tall, heavy, the kind of weight that comes from sitting in trucks and eating diner food. He climbed the porch steps in 2 strides and stopped a foot from her face. "You bought this place," he said. It was not a question. "I did." "How much?" "That's not your business." "It is my business," he said. "My family's land sits on 3 sides of yours. The 4th side is the road. Nobody buys this house except me. That's how it's been since before you were born, lady." Eleanor did not move. "You shouldn't be in there," he said. "It's not safe. The roof's bad. The well's dry. I'll buy you out today. Cash. $500. You take it and you go home." "I am home." The man's jaw worked. He looked at her face as if trying to find the part of her that would crack. $700. "No. 1,000. That's what your suitcase is worth, plus a bus ticket back to wherever your kids live." The mention of kids did something behind Eleanor's ribs that she did not let show on her face. "Get off my porch," she said. He smiled. It was not a friendly smile. He told her his name was Hollis Drennan and that she had not heard the last of him, and then he got back in the truck and drove off. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched the dust trail down the road until she could not see it anymore. Then she went inside and locked the door behind her. She spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning. She found a broom in the pantry. She found rags under the kitchen sink. She swept the dust into piles and the piles into a paper bag. She wiped down the counter and the table and the seat of the wooden chair by the front window. She filled a kettle from the bottled water she had brought and lit a fire in the wood stove with kindling from the porch. While she worked, she looked, without seeming to look. There were photographs on the bookshelf. A black and white wedding picture of a small woman with dark eyes. A color photograph of the same woman, older now, in a garden somewhere, smiling at someone behind the camera. A framed letter, the handwriting too small to read from across the room. The locked roll-top desk against the back wall of the parlor stayed locked. There was no key in any drawer she opened. She did not force it. She had no reason yet. By dusk the front room was clean enough to live in. She sat down in the wooden chair by the window with a cup of tea in her hands and watched the last of the gray daylight bleed out of the sky over a field that, 12 hours ago, had not belonged to her. Her shoulders dropped for the first time in 3 years. She closed her eyes. She thought, just before sleep took her, that the attic could wait until morning. Whatever was up there had been up there a long time. It would still be up there when she woke up. She slept in the chair. She slept like a person who had been carrying something heavy and had finally set it down. Then a board creaked. Eleanor's eyes opened. For a half-second she did not remember where she was. The room was black. The wood stove had burned down to red coals. Then the floorboard creaked again and she was awake all the way. Someone was in the house. She did not move. She kept her breath shallow and her eyes half closed. The sound was coming from the parlor. The room with the locked roll-top desk. A wooden drawer opened slowly. Then a second drawer. Then a soft curse, low and male and young. Eleanor reached out, as quietly as her old hands would let her, and lifted the cast-iron poker out of its hook beside the stove. She stood up. She walked across the front room in her stocking feet. The dust she had swept that afternoon meant the floor barely creaked under her weight. She came around the corner with the poker raised. A boy of maybe 20 was kneeling in front of the roll-top desk with a flashlight in his teeth and a screwdriver in his hand. He was working on the lock. He was so focused on the lock, he did not see her until the iron poker tapped him once on the shoulder. He screamed. The flashlight clattered to the floor. He fell back on his elbows. Eleanor stood over him with the poker. She did not raise it. She did not need to. "Whose son are you?" she said. He did not answer. He didn't have to. She had seen the truck in the driveway. She had heard the gravel. "Get out of my house, son. And tell your father I said the next time he sends a child to do a man's work, I'll meet him at the door myself." The boy ran. She locked the door behind him. She stood in the front room with the poker still in her hand and listened to her own breath until it slowed. Then she walked over to the roll-top desk and looked at the lock. He had almost gotten it open. She did not sleep again that night. She sat in the wooden chair with the poker across her knees and watched the windows. In the morning, a county sheriff's deputy came up the drive in a brown cruiser. He stepped out and tipped his hat and asked her if she had a minute. She said she had a great many minutes now. He smiled politely and said there had been a complaint. Mr. Drennan had called the sheriff to report that an elderly woman, possibly suffering from confusion, had purchased a property that he believed had not been legally available for auction. There were title issues, the deputy said. A land trust had filed a claim against the parcel that morning. He would need her to come down to the courthouse and answer some questions. Eleanor said she would be happy to. After breakfast, the deputy left. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. Because this is where it stops being about one angry neighbor. This is where it turns into something a lot bigger. She drove to the courthouse in the rented truck. She wore her good dress, the one she had folded into the suitcase and not unpacked since the cab. She walked into the records office at 9 in the morning and asked to see the file on the property she had purchased. The clerk handed it to her. She sat at a wooden table in the corner and read it for 2 hours. What she learned was this. The previous owner was a woman named Margaret Voss. She had died alone in that house at the age of 91 3 years before. There had been no funeral notice, no probate filing, no will found. She had no immediate family. The county had taken the property after the unpaid taxes hit a threshold. The auction had been scheduled, postponed twice, scheduled again. Each time, a delay had come from a different source. Once, a county records error. Once, a question of whether the property fell inside a state preservation district. Once, a request from a private land trust for a title review. The land trust was named the Holyoke Foundation. Eleanor wrote the name down on a corner of the file folder. She walked from the records office to the courthouse cafeteria and bought herself a coffee. While she drank it, she watched a man in a suit and a man in a feed cap come through the front doors and walk together to the second floor. The man in the feed cap was Hollis Drennan. She finished her coffee. She walked up to the second floor. There was a small conference room with a glass door. Drennan and the man in the suit were sitting on one side of a table. On the other side, a young woman in jeans and a sweater was on her feet, gesturing. The young woman was angry. The man in the suit was talking calmly. Drennan was watching the door. When Drennan saw Eleanor through the glass, his face did something she had only seen on one man in her life, when her son had explained why the joint account was empty. She knew the look. Not anger, not surprise. The look of a man who has been planning something for a long time and has just realized that the plan has slipped. She walked into the room. The young woman turned. She was in her 30s. She introduced herself. She was a curator from the State Historical Society. She had received a call that morning from the records office because of a flag on the file. She was here, she said, because the Holyoke Foundation had no legal claim on the property and she wanted that on the record before any title transfer was challenged. Eleanor sat down. She set her coffee on the table. She said very quietly, "Why does any of this matter to anyone? It's a falling-down farmhouse on a half-acre." The curator looked at Drennan. Drennan said nothing. The man in the suit closed his briefcase. The curator turned back to Eleanor and said, "Mrs. Pratt, may I ask if you have been in the attic yet?" Eleanor said no. The curator said, "I would like to be there when you go up." She drove the curator out to the house in the rented truck. The curator's name was Anna Lou, and she was younger than Eleanor's daughter. She talked the whole way out. She talked about Margaret Voss the way you talk about a person you have studied for years without ever meeting. Margaret Voss had been born in 1912. She had grown up in New York. In her early 20s, she had worked at a small art gallery on the Lower East Side. In 1939, she had married a young painter named Theodore Voss. He was 26. She was 27. They had moved to a farmhouse in the country because the city had been too loud for him to work. Theodore had painted there for 14 years until he died of a heart attack in his studio in 1953. Eleanor said she had never heard of him. Anna said most people hadn't until about 1972. Then a gallery in Chicago had shown 3 of his canvases and a critic had used the word that changes everything. By 1985, Theodore Voss was being discussed as one of the most important American abstract painters of the post-war period. By 2005, a single small canvas had sold at auction for $4.1 million. Eleanor drove for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "And his wife?" Anna said, "His wife outlived him by 47 years. She gave away nothing. Not one painting. Not one drawing. Not one letter. The estate was assumed to have been sold privately or destroyed in the years after his death. Every major museum in the country has been looking for the Voss archive for 40 years. Nobody has ever found it." Eleanor pulled into her own driveway. Anna got out of the truck and looked up at the porch and said, very quietly, "Oh my God!" They climbed the stairs together to the second floor. Eleanor took the rope handle of the attic hatch in both hands. She pulled. The hatch came down with a complaint of old wood and old hinges, and a folding ladder unfolded from above. Dust drifted down through a column of cold gray light. Eleanor went up first. The attic was bigger than she had expected. The roof beams arched up over her head. There was a small round window at one end that let in the morning. The floor was bare board. The space was almost empty. Almost. In the center of the room sat one steamer trunk. It was old. Dark leather, brass fittings, the kind of trunk people had crossed oceans with. There was a tag tied to the handle with cotton string. The handwriting on the tag had faded, but Eleanor could still read it. For whoever finds this. MV. Eleanor knelt down beside the trunk. The latches were not locked. They had been left unlocked on purpose. She put her thumbs under them and pushed up. The latches popped. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in old linen sheets, were paintings. Not prints. Not reproductions. Original canvases, small ones, the size of a piece of writing paper, stacked on edge in a wooden frame that held them apart from each other. Behind them was a leather portfolio of pencil drawings. Behind that, a stack of letters tied with brown string. At the very bottom, a single larger canvas, wrapped separately, in oilcloth. Anna made a sound behind Eleanor that was not a word. Eleanor lifted the first small canvas out and held it up to the light from the round window. It was a portrait. A young woman with dark eyes. Black hair pinned at the nape of her neck. A green dress. The face was painted with the kind of attention a man only gives when he is painting somebody he loves more than he can say. In the lower right corner there was a signature in red. T. Voss. 1942. Anna sat down on the floor of the attic. She put her hands over her mouth. She stayed like that for a long time. Eleanor unwrapped the larger canvas at the bottom. It was the same woman, older now, sitting in a chair by a window. The light from the window made one half of her face gold and left the other half in shadow. The painting was unfinished. There were pencil lines visible at the edges. It had been the last thing he was working on the day he died. Eleanor sat down on the floor next to Anna. For a long time neither of them said anything. Then Anna said, in a voice that was barely a whisper, "Mrs. Pratt, I need you to understand what you are sitting next to." Eleanor said, "I think I do." Anna said, "There are 273 pieces in that trunk. I counted while you were unwrapping. Sketches, studies, finished canvases, and the final unfinished work. Plus the correspondence with Lee Krasner and Mark Rothko and 3 other people whose letters museums have been bidding for since the 1970s. I cannot tell you what the total value is, because nothing this complete has ever come up. But I can tell you it is not less than $40 million. I would not be surprised if it is twice that." Eleanor looked at the small portrait still in her hands. She said, "How did Hollis Drennan know?" Anna said, "His grandfather was Margaret's lawyer in the 1960s. The grandfather kept private notes. Hollis inherited those notes when his father died. We have known about the Drennan family interest for about 10 years. They have been waiting for this property to come back on the market since Margaret outlived their original timetable. They expected it to sell at a sheriff's auction for under $2,000. They expected to be the only bidder." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "They almost were." Anna said, "Mrs. Pratt, the trunk has your name on it." Eleanor looked at her. Anna said, "The tag says, 'For whoever finds this.' You found this. By every law of probate and property in this state, this trunk and everything in it is yours." Eleanor sat in the dust of the attic with a $40 million painting on her knees. She said, "I thought I had nothing left." Anna said nothing. There was nothing to say. The story broke 3 days later. It was a small art trade journal that ran it first because Anna had called them. By the end of the week it was on the front page of the regional paper, and by the end of the month it was on a national news show. Footage of the farmhouse from a helicopter. A photograph of Eleanor on her porch in the good dress, taken by a reporter she had let inside on the condition he made her tea. The phone in the farmhouse, which she had hooked up after the second day, started ringing at 6 in the morning and did not stop until she unplugged it at 10 that night. 3 of the calls were from her daughter. 2 of the calls were from her son. 1 was from the grandson. who had used his mother's phone without permission. She listened to all of the voicemails. She listened to them once, all the way through, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap. Her daughter cried in hers. Her son was businesslike in his. He used the words "as a family" 4 times in 2 minutes. The grandson's was 40 seconds long. He said only that he was sorry. He said he had not known. He said he hoped she was warm at night. Eleanor saved that one. The others she deleted. She did not call any of them back. She did not sell everything. She gave most of it away, not to the highest bidder, to a small museum in the state where Margaret had grown up, the kind of museum that had a single underpaid curator and a sign out front that needed repainting. She gave them 260 pieces, on the condition that the collection be displayed together, in a single named room, and that the room be called the Margaret Voss Gallery. Not the Theodore Voss Gallery. The Margaret Voss Gallery. She kept 13 pieces. 6 of them she sold quietly at auction over the next 2 years for an amount of money that was more than she could think about without going still. She used the money to do 3 things. She paid off the small debts that had been carried in her name since her son's joint account. She bought the farmhouse a new roof and a new well and a new wood stove. She paid the rest forward to a foundation she set up in Margaret's name, for older women who had been left at the curb with their suitcases. A fund that paid first and last month's rent and a security deposit on a place of their own, and a year of legal advice from a lawyer who would not let their grown children take what was left. The other 7 pieces she kept on the walls of the farmhouse. The portrait of Margaret as a young woman went over the front room mantel, where it could see the rocking chair and the wood stove and the door. Hollis Drennan tried to sue her. He lost. He tried to sue Anna's office. He lost that too. She saw him once after that, at the gas station on the county road, 6 months later. He was paying for a tank of fuel and a pack of cigarettes. He looked at her across the counter and his mouth opened to say something and then closed again. She nodded at him as if he were a stranger she had passed in a hallway. He nodded back the same way. That was the last time they ever spoke. The boy who had come into her house with the screwdriver had a different ending. He showed up on her porch on a Saturday morning the spring after the auction. He was alone. He had a new haircut and old work boots. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and said he was sorry. He said he had been wrong. He said he was looking for work and that he understood if she said no. She thought about it for a long minute. Then she said the porch boards needed replacing and that she would pay fair wage for fair work. He worked on her porch every Saturday for the rest of that summer. They did not talk much. By the end of the summer, the porch did not sag anymore. In October, on the evening of her 81st birthday, Eleanor sat in a rocking chair on that new porch with a cup of tea. The sky was gray and a slow rain had begun to fall. Came down on the new boards. It came down on the field that was hers now and the road that ran past her gate. It fell the way it had fallen on the cab a year before, on the curb where her son had locked her out. Fell the same. It just wasn't falling on her anymore. There was a new suitcase by the front door. She had bought it on a trip into town and she did not know exactly why. She had not packed it. It was empty. It would stay empty. The grandson called that night to wish her a happy birthday. She answered. She told him she loved him. She told him she would see him at Christmas if his mother let him come on the bus, and that she would pay for the ticket. He said his mother might. She said that was all right either way. She hung up. She sat in the rocking chair until the dark came and the rain stopped and the cold finally drove her inside. She locked the door behind her. Not because she was afraid, because the door was hers to lock. She climbed the stairs and went to bed in a room with a portrait of a young woman on the wall, painted in 1942 by a man who had loved his wife. She slept the way she had slept that first night in the wooden chair, like a person who had set something heavy down and had finally found her way home.